understanding is that forces allied to the Turks have now taken at least 7 villages right up there on the border. Who are these forces? They are Arabs, they are Syrians, they were called the Free Syrian Army. They used to fight Bashar al-Assad, but now they have been armed and trained by the Turks, and Turkey has employed them to fight its own enemy, the Kurds. What are the Turks trying to do? Well, I think there's an old-fashioned phrase for it. It's called ethnic cleansing. What President Erdogan wants to do is to move Syrian refugees, Arabs, into that border area, and that would form a buffer between the Kurds on the Turkish side, who he's fighting, and the Kurds on this side, the Syrian side. That's why he's bombing civilian areas. And as we've seen today, tens of thousands of Kurds are fleeing their homes.
As we drove in, they were driving out. Thousands of Kurdish civilians who until yesterday had been living perfectly peacefully along the border with Turkey. They had a life, a de facto Kurdish government, and they thought American support. They blame 2 powerful men.
Trump is good.
Trump not good.
No, is good, Trump.
And Turkey?
Erdogan is a terrorist. We are not terrorists. Erdogan is terrorist.
Thousands of people are streaming out of Kamishli as it's shelled now. One woman just cried out at us, "We don't fear God, but why are they killing us?"
Kamishli was shelled this afternoon and yesterday evening and night. Hard to see that this is fighting terrorism, as the Turks say. Civilians live here, and neither they nor the administration here posed a threat to Turkey. Another target was the border town of Tal Abyad, which was shelled all day from across the border. This is softening up, getting the civilians to flee before an incursion. Casualties were brought to the hospital at Hasaka further south. People who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, who survived 4 years of battle against the Islamic State, only to be injured when they thought the war was over.
Shrapnel from a bomb fell on his arm, and of course there are injuries on his head, his neck, his chest, his abdomen. He needs big surgery to stop the bleeding.
Overnight, the Turkish military moved along the massive concrete wall they had built with EU support to stop Syrians from escaping war. Now they're knocking it down, not so refugees can flee to safety, but so the Turks can bring war back to Syria. Syrian Kurdish forces are preparing their retaliation. They beat the Islamic State. They have US training and weapons, but their allies have deserted them. And Turkey is a member of NATO with a giant army and resources they can only dream of. Along the border, the explosions continued all day. Even the birds don't seem to know where to go. The Syrian Kurds helped the US and Europe defeat the Islamic State. This is their reward.
And the Islamic State is the issue which is on the minds of many leaders in Western countries, because the Kurds are guarding camps with several thousand Islamic State prisoners in them. Now, what they're saying is that they may have to desert those camps and go and fight the Turks. And certainly they are firing back. There have been casualties on both sides of this war. The Europeans have completely neglected to deal with these camps, to provide the aid that the Kurds need, both militarily to secure those camps and also to feed and clothe the people inside them. And we know that the Islamic State leader al-Baghdadi has told the people in those camps, the people who still are devoted to the Islamic State, that they should try and break out. Will President Erdogan make sure that those people, those ISIS people, don't get back to Europe, don't start killing people here again? It's very hard to see that he's going to do that. Also, what we're hearing now is that people up on the border are just terrified. We got a message from a women's village. This was somewhere where we were back in March. This was a village of women who had fled abusive men, or women who, just Kurdish women who wanted to live their own lives. They sent a message tonight saying that people near them, villages near them, were now deserted, that their people had been killed in the surrounding area, and that they were just terrified.
Lindsay Hilsum in Kamishli, near the Syrian border. She's inside Syria there with that report.
Well, with Turkey's offensive, which it has called Operation Peace Spring, in full force, is there any chance the international community can have any influence on events on the ground? Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Jonathan Rugman has this report.
The Turkish army crossed last night into mostly Arab areas of Syria in the hope of encountering less resistance there. This is their third cross-border operation during the Syrian civil war, but it's also by far the most ambitious. The Turks say their F-16s are not targeting civilians or civilian buildings, but these jets have bombed 18 miles into Syria, forcing thousands to flee. And the fear is the so-called buffer zone they are helping to create could become permanent. Most major political parties in Turkey have voted in favour of this operation, though President Erdogan stands accused of bombing Kurds to boost his popularity after 16 years in power. And these are his foot soldiers, Syrian Arab militiamen, paid and trained by Ankara to recapture Arab towns from Syrian Kurds, though their agenda may be to Arabize the entire Syrian border in the name of Turkey's security. This operation began with F-16s flying from an airbase in Diyarbakir to hit targets near the majority Arab areas of Tel Abyad, Ras Al Ain and Ad Darbassia. Howitzer artillery positioned on the border shelled what the Turks call terrorist positions. The Turks say they want to create a so-called safe zone 20 miles deep, running 300 miles along the border, which they say will eventually house up to 2 million Syrian refugees. It's hardly a surprise that Syrian Kurdish forces have now struck inside Turkey, firing mortar shells at several Turkish towns. 6 Turks were reported to have been killed. The EU has called on Turkey to stop its operation and not to alter Syria's population by force.
We very much call upon Turkey to cease all violence and not to add to, and here I would use the word chaos, which is already existing in the region.
But it may be too late for that. The EU has pledged President Erdogan €6 billion to look after Syrian refugees. Criticise him, and not for the first time, he threatens to export them to Europe.
Hey Avrupa Birliği.
Hey European Union, pull yourself together. I say it again. If you try to label this operation as an invasion, it's very simple. We will open the gates and send 3.6 million refugees your way.
A far more serious threat comes from these ISIS prisoners of war held inside Syria. The Turks say they will only take responsibility for those inside their 20-mile limit, and they're trying to convince their European allies that they won't escape in the battle for territory. But the Turks do have overwhelming military force, and as a NATO ally, they may feel that for all the criticism from Europe and from America, nobody can really stop them now.
Well, Jonathan is at the Foreign Office tonight. Jonathan, what are relations like between the UK and Turkey, and what has the British government been saying?
Well, relations are very good. I'd say they're probably the closest of any country in Europe. In fact, the political director of the Foreign Office is the former British ambassador to Turkey. We know that the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, was on the phone to his Turkish counterpart, Mevlut Çavuşoğlu. He urged restraint, he urged the Turks to reconsider, and he asked them to focus on these ISIS prisoners and indeed on fighting ISIS, because I think the big issue for the British is this: how are the Turks going to take control of prisons with ISIS prisoners in them if they are bombing the very people who are jailing those prisoners at the moment? So that is the main British security concern. I'm not sure how much leverage we have here, though. I think if this begins to look like an Arabization operation, if this has any resemblance whatsoever to what Saddam Hussein did in northern Iraq when he moved Arabs into Kurdish areas, then the leverage that we might have, and indeed that the European Union might have, is that they would withhold humanitarian aid from any resettlement operations that took place in northern Syria. And as yet, we just don't know what terms those Syrian refugees are going to be returned to Syria on, and whether it will be voluntary, involuntary, or what's going to happen at all.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. And within the last hour, a UN spokesman in New York has warned Turkey that it faces repercussions if it fails to protect civilians or allows ISIS to reconstitute. As for President Trump, downplaying America's ties to the Kurds seems to be his latest strategy as he attempts to defend his decision to withdraw US troops in Syria, which is what triggered Turkey to launch its offensive. But Republicans and Democrats remain unified in criticism of the president for abandoning an ally. Our Washington correspondent, Siobhan Kennedy, is at the White House now. Siobhan.
Well, Jackie, as the shells rain down and the casualties continue to rise, Donald Trump has continued to distance himself today from the Turkish offensive. He's continued his standard mantra on Twitter that the Turks and the Kurds have been fighting each other forever, and he simply wants to pull the US out of what he calls endless wars. He says he will come down hard on the Turkish government if they don't play by the rules, but who knows what those rules are. Certainly Donald Trump doesn't seem to be giving us any. And when it comes to expressing any allegiance with the Kurdish forces, the US partners, here's what the president had to say.
Now, the Kurds are fighting for their land, just so you understand. They're fighting for their land. And as somebody wrote in a very, very powerful article today, they didn't help us in the Second World War. They didn't help us with Normandy, as an example. They mentioned names of different battles.
Well, whether or not they did, most people are left scratching their heads at that comment, I have to say. And an increasing number of Republicans make the point that it's about us now abandoning our partners, the Kurdish forces that we have fought with to put down ISIS. It's about leaving them now to face the onslaught of the Turkish troops on their own. And it's not just Republicans who are outraged. This is Susan Rice speaking earlier today. She was the National Security Advisor under President Obama for 4 years.
The fight against ISIS was one that President Obama initiated, got 65 or more of our partners and allies to join with us, and put ISIS on the path to defeat. President Trump came in and continued that fight appropriately. And now all of a sudden, when Erdogan places a phone call and asks President Trump for this extraordinary capitulation to our partners and allies, President Trump said yes. And you have to wonder why. It's not just because he's sick and tired of wars in the Middle East. This is a very economical investment that the United States has made with very minimal U.S. personnel on the ground.
Well, earlier I spoke with Sinam Mohammed, who is the representative of the Syrian Democratic Council, the political wing of the SDF, their representative here in Washington. And she said, as predicted all week, that it's the civilians, the Kurdish civilians, the families who are bearing the brunt of this onslaught thus far, an onslaught that Turkey says is in the name of bringing about peace.
Peace will not come by war, through war. And they called even this operation, it is the spring of peace, which is, I don't see any peace in this. I see the spring of war and catastrophe. It will be a humanitarian catastrophe for the region because we have millions, 5 million people inhabited in this region. If it happened, where can they go? We hope that the international community, the European Parliament, all they can stop these aggressions of invasion of Turkey.
Right now, she says on that point that all they are receiving from Europe and around the world is effectively warm words. But when it comes to actual help on the ground to help support the Kurds and their families, that really they are simply being left to defend themselves.
Siobhan Kennedy, thanks very much. John.
Well, here in London, I've been speaking with the Turkish ambassador to the UK, Ümit Yalçın, and I asked him whether President Trump had given the green light for Turkey's operation.
We have been talking with Americans for a long time to create a safe zone in our border territory in Syria. And all those talks and negotiations remained inconclusive. And then we took this decision for the unilateral military operation.
But did President Trump say, yes, go ahead?
According to their telephone conversation and his statements, I mean the president's statements, American president's statements, they announced that they are not standing against Turkey, and they are starting withdrawal of their forces from the ground.
10 or 11,000 Kurds have died in fighting ISIS. Their sacrifice has been to Turkey's advantage.
We every time advised and warned our allies and friends from the beginning that using one terrorist organization against another terrorist organization is a dangerous one, unethical one, wrong one, and dangerous one. We said this from the beginning. Instead of trusting and relying on a NATO ally, relying on and trusting one terrorist organization to keep the other terrorist organization is wrong.
But there was no enthusiasm by your NATO allies that you should go in and do this. None at all.
I think our allies should support us, show solidarity with us, because I would like to remind you and to the people who are watching us that Turkish border is also European security border, NATO border. Whatever we have done so far for solving the Syrian conflict in political pillar, in humanitarian area, and in counterterrorism effects, we made tremendous contribution, not only to save our border, also to save European continent border.
But the Kurds have done a very good job. They've been holding tens of thousands of ISIS prisoners. I mean, how are you going to look after all those prisoners that they held?
Two things I would like to mention. One is PYD-YPG, for us terrorist organization, is creating tremendous oppression and cruelty under his control area. There are many local Syrians, I mean, their grievances have not been heard so far.
Why should we trust Turkey?
If our NATO allies and our friends prefer trusting and believing in terrorist organization against another one, it should be very sad.
But that's what's been going on for years.
But we, Turkey, also engaged in chest-to-chest combat against Daesh on the ground. Only Turkish army did this. We already had killed more than 4,000 Daesh terrorists in Syria, in Iraq, in Turkey. And we became victims in Turkey under Daesh terrorist attacks in many cities.
Well, no, I mean, Europe has paid Turkey billions to look after 3.6 million Syrian refugees. Now, President Erdogan is actually threatening to release them into Europe. I mean, you know, is this the act of a NATO ally?
This is not a threat. For 8 years, we have been giving shelter to 3.5 million Syrians, and we did everything by ourselves.
And you've been paid a great deal of money to do it.
Yes, and also
a great deal of money.
And we are also looking after more than 5 million Syrians in the northern west part of Syria as well, in the areas which we liberated from Daesh and PYD-YPG in Jarablus and in Afrin. Because of that reason, we cannot consider that kind of narrative as a threat. We only would like to remind our friends and our partners that what we have done, not only for our security, but preventing irregular migration, we are also making our contribution to the European security.
Ambassador, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you.
Turkey's ambassador to London talking to me earlier, but now I've also been speaking to Salim Muslim, a former co-president of the Syrian Kurdish Democratic Union Party, the PYD. He's in Rojava, a region of northeastern Syria, now under bombardment. And asked him if he felt this was indeed the start of a major offensive.
No, I think it's underway because since yesterday's 24 hours, they are shelling, bombarding by artilleries.
What are you worried about? Are you a particular target?
We are afraid if they can go to some villages and so to make the massacres as they have done before, because now what Turkey is doing is preparing the ways, paving the way for their invasion to come into Syria, into the villages.
It is clear that the Americans support what is going on, but Europe and the rest of NATO is clearly opposed to what is happening. What do you want them to do
Well, I think Americans are not supporting them. They given them the green lights. I mean, they could stop them. They didn't do it. So this dangerous situation is for everybody, and especially for the European countries.
I have just spoken to the Turkish ambassador here in London, and he says it's you who have attacked, particularly the PKK have attacked Turkey, and that you had this coming to you.
We never attacked anybody. We've never done anything to anybody. Since 9 years, we are fighting, I mean, against Turkey. And now, because they were defeated, maybe Turkey wants to get the revenge of them.
Do you have ISIS prisoners? Have you got a lot of refugees too, or is it just your community?
No, we have prisoners. I mean, ISIS prisoners. I mean, our friends in Democratic Syrian Forces, they were talking about 12,000.
What will happen to them?
Well, we are trying to keep them, I mean, in the prison till we find a solution. And this solution is not only by us. I mean, we are looking for the international court. We are trying to make it with everybody.
Saleh Muslim, thank you very much indeed for talking with us. Thank you.
Well, Turkey's invasion into the Kurdish-held north isn't the only ferociously contested space in Syria. Further west, the province of Idlib remains another bastion of the rebellion against the Assad regime. But over half of Idlib is now controlled by a coalition of jihadi groups, many with strong links to al-Qaeda. Porrick O'Brien has a rare portrait of life in the province, where the militants have established a state within a state, recruiting children for the fight against Assad and his Russian allies.
Welcome to Idlib, one of the last rebel strongholds in Syria, and, according to one US official, home to the largest collection of al-Qaeda affiliates in the world. The most powerful, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS. It translates as the liberators of the Levant. Channel 4 News has viewed hundreds of hours of their propaganda footage online, trying to piece together what life's actually like under HTS. Not just on the front line, but at their fundraising events, at their recruitment drives, at the public institutions where HTS holds sway. Over 4 million people now live in Idlib. Almost half of them have fled from other parts of Syria. The province is about the same size as Devon. The Turkish border to the north is closed. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham occupy over half the area, but also provide cover for other international jihadist groups. The rest of Idlib is controlled by, among others, the Turkish-backed National Liberation Front. The province is surrounded by Assad's forces to the south. In other words, Idlib is cornered. Rooting out one-time al-Qaeda affiliates like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is the reason the regime and its allies give for attacking Idlib. So, who are HTS?
To me, HTS is clearly a group which advocates Islamic government. It advocates the application of Sharia law in any area that it is in control of. I think it's very clear that there are also members of al-Qaeda inside it.
The difference between HTS and Islamic State, for example. IS had global ambitions. HTS, on the other hand, present themselves, at least, as a legitimate local actor, as the voice of the Syrian people. Their history in Syria, though, is more complicated. At the beginning of the war, for example, established themselves in the country by fighting anti-Assad forces. Also, they facilitated IS's original foothold in Raqqa. More recently, formed alliances with other jihadist groups in Idlib to consolidate power. And with every change of tack, a rebrand.
فقد قررنا إلغاء العمل باسم جبهة النصرة.
Its leader, the Syrian Abu Muhammad al-Jalani. The rebrands, his idea. The message, HTS is Syrian, born and bred.
ليس له علاقة بأي جهة خارجية.
HTS have been stronger at certain times and weaker at certain times. Alliances with other groups have strengthened and broken as the years have gone on. But I think it's very fair to say that they could mobilise about 40,000 men if they wanted to.
So they could mobilise an estimated 40,000 fighters at their strongest, alliances included. But they are not at their strongest. HTS has sustained heavy losses in recent months at the hands of Assad's forces and his Russian and Iranian allies. So their recruitment drive has gone into overdrive. This is recent footage from one of the giant displacement camps in Idlib. People, including children, with nowhere left to go, volunteering for the front line. Alongside the recruitment campaign, the fundraisers, in the incongruous collection, cash, jewellery, grenades.
وهن عم يفدونا بأرواحهم ونحن عم نقدم إليهم ما نستطيع.
HTS's main income stream is not second-hand gold fillings and grenades. The group has established a de facto statelet within Idlib. It controls schools, the police, the machinery of local government. It also controls taxes, borders, and excise duty. This is Abu al-Abid Ashida, one of the leaders of HTS. He was arrested recently after accusing the organization of corruption. During the interview, he indicated that HTS brings in about $13 million a month. But there is more to Idlib than HTS. If you want real Idlib born and bred, go to the main market in the city.
لأنه هاي بلدنا خلقنا فيها وربينا فيها وبدنا نموت فيها. وين بدنا نروح؟ ما في غير هالبلد تحوينا، ما ضل إدلب بعد إدلب.
In fact, the people here have an uneasy relationship with HTS. Some support them, some tolerate them, others demonstrate against them. See them not as liberators, but as an occupying force undermining the original revolution.
بحب أوجه رسالة لعناصر الهيئة، نحن هون مدينة محررة وما لنا بحاجة لتحرير وما عندنا أي ذريعة لأنه ينهجم عليها من أي فصيل ثاني.
The future of Idlib and HTS are now bound together, whether the people there like it or not. If an all-out offensive begins, will HTS dig in? And what will become of the people who live here if the battle for Idlib blows up? The Syrian people have seen the answer to that last question more times than they can bear to remember.
Warwick O'Brien reporting.